There is a record kept deep within the archives of the Society for Research and Enlightenment, a document few would expect to hear. It dates from 1943, near the end of Edgar Cayce's life, when his physical health was failing. Yet, his lucidity in his hypnotic state reached an uncanny accuracy. That afternoon, witnesses reported that something was different even before he began to speak. Cayce lay on his back, eyes closed, and his breathing slowed until he seemed to have almost left the room entirely. The stenographer later wrote that the atmosphere changed as if the very air had become heavy and silent. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight unlike any he had ever spoken before. He was not speaking of a person. He was speaking of a nation. He's talking about America and about a starting point in 2027. Now, before we go any further, I want you to pause for a moment. If you found your way to the connection, then something in you is curious about the deeper patterns behind this history. So before you get completely absorbed in this story, and believe me, it's going to get even stranger, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who questions reality like you do, and subscribe to the channel. While watching, keep an open mind. And when something strikes you, I want you to write it in the comments. Not just what you think, but what you feel. Because Cayce believes that emotions are always closer to the truth than intellect. The reading itself was unsettling to those present, not because it predicted mere destruction, but because it predicted transformation. Cayce described a threshold, a moment in history when American identity would begin to change on a deeper level than politics, deeper than economics, even deeper than culture. The transcript was marked for restricted circulation. For decades, only high-level researchers were allowed to study it, and even many devoted believers never heard its full contents. When Cayce awoke from his hypnotic state, he reportedly refused to discuss it. He was often comfortable speaking of cures and reincarnation, but he did not address this interpretation, this vision of America's future. However, over time, a misunderstanding arose around his prophecies. Many believed he foresaw catastrophe, the collapse of a nation, the end of a civilization, but that was never the essence of what he described. Cayce did not see destruction. He saw initiation. He saw a process where collapse and rebirth were inseparable. What appeared outwardly as breakdown was in his interpretation the removal of structures that could no longer contain the next stage of human awareness. He insisted America was not simply a country. It was what he called a soul experiment. According to his life readings, multiple streams of ancient civilizations had converged there through reincarnation. Souls from Atlantis carrying memories of technological power. Souls from Egypt carrying fragments of spiritual knowledge. Souls from empires that had risen and fallen across centuries. All drawn to one geographical place for unfinished spiritual work. Freedom, equality, dignity. These were not just political ideas to Cayce. They were energetic blueprints waiting to be lived, and the nation, in his view, had only partially fulfilled them. Witnesses noticed that whenever Cayce entered readings about America, his demeanor changed. During health readings, he was calm. During past life sessions, he was detached. But during national future readings, he sometimes wept in trance. He would awaken shaken, emotionally exhausted, as though he had experienced events rather than merely described them. Yet, he always repeated the same phrase afterward. America's greatest trial would become its greatest awakening. He described the period beginning around 2027 as a crossing point, a karmic cycle completing 250 years after the early formation of the nation's governing structure. To Cayce, cycles mattered. He believed collective souls, like individual souls, faced moments where unresolved contradictions surfaced simultaneously. America, he said, was founded upon both profound ideals and profound shadows. The language of liberty existed alongside enslavement. Expansion occurred alongside displacement. Unity coexisted with hierarchy. Those tensions, he believed, could not remain unresolved forever. Beginning at the threshold year, he described three processes accelerating at the same time not sequentially but together. The land would begin changing physically. Systems built on older principles would lose stability, and human perception itself would begin shifting. These were not separate events. He believed they were expressions of one underlying transformation, consciousness altering its relationship with reality. When Cayce spoke of Earth changes, he did not frame them as random disasters. He suggested the environment responded to human collective patterns. Areas carrying heavy historical trauma would experience release. He spoke of coastlines altering, regions of geological instability activating, and unexpected natural activity appearing in places long considered stable. But he emphasized repeatedly, these were not punishments. They were adjustments, the planet responding as a living system. He also spoke about institutions. He said systems dependent on control and extraction would struggle to maintain coherence as public awareness shifted. People would begin questioning the meaning of value, authority, and even money itself. In one 1938 reading, he suggested a moment would come when enough people recognize currency as an agreement rather than intrinsic reality. When belief changed, the system sustaining it would weaken. Communities, he said, would temporarily rely more on direct exchange, cooperation, and local support networks. Yet perhaps his most controversial statement concerned perception. Cayce predicted that between the late 2020s and early 2030s, large numbers of people would begin experiencing reality differently. Not just philosophical change, but experiential change, intuition intensifying, unexplained knowing, vivid dreams, memories, and perceptions not easily categorized. He did not describe it as hallucination. He described it as awareness expanding beyond the narrow sensory filter humans typically rely upon. He compared it to realizing you were dreaming while still inside the dream. The physical world would remain, but its meaning would change. Identity would shift from purely physical existence to something layered and continuous. He believed this shift would frighten many at first because it challenged long-held assumptions about consciousness. I want you to think about that carefully. Not whether you believe it, but whether you've ever had a moment, even a brief one, where reality felt larger than it appeared. If you have, tell me in the comments. You might be surprised how many others have experienced the same thing. Cayce said after the years of disruption, a different social structure would gradually appear, not imposed through revolution, but emerging locally. Communities guided by trust and recognition rather than competition. Decision-making based less on conflict and more on shared understanding. He believed humanity would not abandon technology or progress, but would integrate them with a deeper awareness of connection. He even spoke of children born around the early 2020s. He suggested some would naturally perceive relationships, emotions, and authenticity with unusual clarity. Adults might misunderstand them, but he saw them as adapted to a different kind of world, one not yet fully visible. And here is where his vision turned unexpectedly hopeful. Cayce believed America's role was not domination, but demonstration, not to control the world, but to model a transition, a society learning through difficulty to align its ideals with its actions, but necessary for integration. All of this leads to a question he never answered directly. Why would someone in the 1940s describe events centered around our exact lifetime? Cayce simply suggested that those hearing the message when the time approached were meant to hear it, not as certainty, but as preparation. So I want to ask you now, not rhetorically, do you feel the world is accelerating in ways difficult to explain? Write it below. Your perspective matters here, because this channel is not just a video. It's a shared observation. Cayce's readings became most intimate when people stopped asking about nations and began asking about themselves. Again and again, seekers would question him not about events, but about their role in them. It was during these sessions that he gave one of his most unusual explanations. He suggested that history is not merely something happening around us, but something happening through us. In his understanding, certain periods in time act like turning points in a much longer story of human consciousness. And at those turning points, particular kinds of personalities tend to appear. Not better people, not chosen people, but prepared people. He described a generation arriving around the early 2020s who would grow up sensing contradictions adults had learned to ignore. These children, he said, would react strongly to artificial authority, to rules without meaning, to learning systems based on memorization rather than understanding. Parents might see defiance. Teachers might see distraction. But Cayce suggested something else, entirely sensitivity to authenticity. They would not easily accept statements simply because an institution said them. They would ask why and then why again, and often adults would struggle to answer. He warned that adults might try to force these children into familiar patterns, believing discipline alone would correct them. But in one reading, he cautioned a mother not to mistake difference for disorder. He explained that sometimes discomfort with a system is not a sign of malfunction. Sometimes it is awareness arriving earlier than expected. He encouraged patience, communication, and above all, listening. According to him, the coming decades would require a type of thinking less rigid, less reactive, and more cooperative than the previous era. The younger generation would naturally lean toward that mindset. Now, I want to pause here for a moment. If you're a parent or even an older sibling, teacher, or guardian, and you've noticed a child who asks strangely deep questions or seems emotionally perceptive beyond their years, tell me in the comments. You may be seeing exactly the pattern Cayce described. And if this conversation is interesting you, this is a perfect moment to share the video with someone who loves exploring these ideas. The more perspectives we gather, the clearer the picture becomes. Cayce also spoke about adults who would feel a different kind of recognition. Not intellectual agreement, but a feeling of remembering. Some people, he said, would encounter certain ideas and feel they already knew them without knowing how. They might feel drawn to study history, symbolism, spirituality, or consciousness not as hobbies, but as necessities. Others would feel restless, sensing that routines that once satisfied them no longer did. He didn't interpret this as dissatisfaction with life itself. He interpreted it as a change in internal priorities. When values shift, environments that once felt secure can begin to feel confining. He explained this carefully to avoid fear. The changes he foresaw were not meant to isolate people. In fact, he believed the opposite would happen. As old structures weakened, individuals would form stronger local relationships. Neighbors would become more important than distant authorities. Shared skill, mutual support, and communication would replace passive dependence. Communities not as political units, but as human networks would regain significance. He emphasized conversation, cooperation, and practical helpfulness as stabilizing forces. His practical advice was strikingly grounded. He encouraged learning how food grows, understanding water sources, maintaining physical health, and developing abilities useful to others. But he insisted motivation mattered more than preparation itself. If people prepared because they feared each other, they would create suspicion. If they prepared because they cared about each other, they would create resilience. The difference, he believed, determined whether hardship divided society or strengthened it. He even addressed emotional readiness. During periods of uncertainty, he said, anxiety spreads faster than events themselves. Rumors, assumptions, and speculation amplify stress. He advised limiting constant exposure to alarming information and balancing awareness with calm reflection. He recommended time outdoors, quiet reflection, and meaningful conversation. In modern terms, we might call it grounding. He simply called it remembering perspective. According to Cayce, one of the hardest adjustments would be psychological rather than physical. People define themselves through roles, job titles, financial status, public identity. If circumstances disrupt those roles, confusion follows. He believed many would discover that who they were internally mattered more than how they were categorized externally. Skills, kindness, reliability, and creativity would carry more weight than credentials alone. He saw it as uncomfortable, but ultimately freeing. There was also a compassionate element in his readings rarely discussed. He spoke about loss, but not in the way disaster predictions often do. He explained that during any large transition, some individuals would not continue through the entire process. He did not frame it as tragedy or punishment, but as completion of purpose from a spiritual perspective. To grieving families, he urged remembrance over fear and connection over despair. He believed relationships, in some form, continue beyond physical absence. Whether one interprets that spiritually or psychologically, his intention was to comfort, not alarm. Another notable part of his vision involved collective honesty. Cayce believed a nation cannot grow without acknowledging its past openly. He suggested a period would come when historical events would be discussed more deeply and emotionally, not merely as facts, but as experiences understood through empathy. He predicted discomfort, defensiveness, and disagreement, yet ultimately understanding. In his view, healing required recognition rather than denial. He also warned that during times of uncertainty, people naturally search for simple answers. Leaders, media voices, and commentators might present absolute certainty, and that certainty would feel reassuring. But Cayce advised discernment. He encouraged individuals to evaluate information carefully, avoid reacting purely from fear, and remain open to dialogue. He considered independent thought combined with compassion the healthiest response to confusion. Cayce's final point about the years after 2027 was surprisingly hopeful. He believed once societies move through uncertainty, cooperation would become more valued than competition. He predicted innovation not only in technology, but in education, medicine, and governance systems designed to serve people rather than control them. Not perfect systems, but more flexible ones. Adaptability, he said, would replace rigidity. He imagined education focusing on curiosity and practical understanding rather than memorization. He imagined healthcare considering emotional and environmental factors alongside physical symptoms. He imagined leadership measured by service rather than status. Whether literal or symbolic, his message centered on maturity, a civilization gradually learning responsibility for its own choices. And perhaps his most consistent message was this: the future is influenced, not fixed. Prophecy to him described tendencies, not inevitabilities. Human decisions mattered. Kindness mattered. Cooperation mattered. The direction depended on participation. So let me ask you directly, when you look at the world right now, do you feel things are breaking apart or rearranging into something different? Write your answer in the comments. There's no correct response, only observation. By the time Edgar Cayce gave his later readings, his health was fading, and those around him sensed he knew his time was limited. Yet strangely, his tone when speaking about the future grew calmer, not more urgent. The dramatic elements of his earlier visions remained, but he emphasized something else more strongly than prediction participation. He repeatedly explained that people misunderstand prophecy because they treat it as a fixed script. He never viewed it that way. To Cayce, the future was a field of probabilities shaped by human behavior. The purpose of describing it was not to frighten anyone, but to influence how they lived in the present. He would often say the most important preparation was not relocation, storage of supplies, or memorizing dates. It was inner stability. When individuals cannot regulate their own fear, they become easily directed by external pressure. He believed calm thinking was a protective force, not passive acceptance, but steady awareness. He encouraged people to examine their reactions. Were they responding to events or reacting to emotions created by interpretation of events? The distinction mattered to him because panic spreads socially. One anxious person influences 10 others, and soon anxiety appears justified, simply because it is widespread. Cayce therefore spoke frequently about attention. What a person give their attention to grows in psychological importance. Constant focus on danger creates a perception that danger is everywhere. Balanced awareness allows practical decisions. He advised staying informed but not consumed, discussing concerns with trusted people rather than isolating, and maintaining routines that preserve normally. Even simple activities, preparing meals, maintaining homes, caring for family, anchored the mind during uncertainty. He also emphasized personal ethics. Periods of instability, he warned, tempt individuals to justify harmful behavior in the name of survival. Yet he insisted character mattered most during hardship. Honesty, fairness, and reliability would determine who communities trusted. He predicted that people known for integrity would naturally become stabilizing figures in their neighborhoods, not through authority, but through reputation. In other words, leadership would quietly shift toward those who demonstrated steadiness rather than those who merely claimed it. There was a strong social dimension in his guidance. Cayce believed isolation amplified fear, while cooperation reduced it. He encouraged forming supportive circles, not ideological groups, but practical relationships. Knowing who could repair something, who could grow food, who could teach, who could listen. Mutual competence built confidence. He viewed community not as dependence, but as shared resilience. Interestingly, he warned about over-reliance on any single source of information. Every era, he said, develops dominant narratives, and people often accept them without reflection because agreement feels safe. He recommended comparing perspectives and remaining willing to adjust opinions. Certainty, he believed, can be comforting but also blinding. Curiosity, though uncomfortable, leads closer to understanding. Emotionally, he acknowledged the coming period might produce fatigue. Continuous change exhausts people mentally. He suggested rest intentionally. Quiet time, reflection, and stepping away from constant stimulation would help maintain clear thinking. He also spoke about gratitude, not as denial of problems, but as balance. Noticing what remains stable prevents the mind from perceiving total collapse when only partial change occurs. Cayce's final descriptions of the period after the early 2030s were notably optimistic. He suggested societies that endured stress together would value cooperation more than competition. Economic activity would continue, but success would be defined less by accumulation and more by contribution. He envisioned businesses built around usefulness and trust. Reputation, he believed, would outweigh advertising. He also predicted a change in how people approach knowledge. Instead of relying exclusively on centralized expertise, individuals would blend professional guidance with personal responsibility. People would learn basic skills, health awareness, practical repair, communication, reducing helplessness during disruptions. This was not a rejection of science or technology, but a complement to it. He thought confidence came from understanding, not dependency. Another important point he made concerned belief itself. Cayce never demanded agreement with his visions. In fact, he discouraged blind belief. He advised testing ideas against experience and observing outcomes. If a concept increased compassion and clarity, it was useful. If it increased fear and division, it was not. For him, the value of a prophecy was not whether every detail occurred, but whether it encouraged wiser living. Near the end of his life, a questioner asked him directly if people should fear the coming changes. Cayce paused before answering even within trance. His reply was simple. Fear comes from feeling powerless. Understanding creates choice, and choice creates responsibility. The future, he said, would challenge humanity not by taking away freedom, but by demanding maturity in how freedom was used. So here we arrive at the real meaning behind his vision. Whether his timeline proves literal or symbolic, his central message remains practical. Strengthen relationships, develop useful abilities, care for physical and mental health, seek accurate information without surrendering independent thought. Act with integrity, even when circumstances are uncertain. These actions prepare a person for any future predicted or not. And perhaps that is why his readings still attract attention decades later. Not because he provided a precise map of events, but because he framed uncertainty as an opportunity to grow wiser rather than more fearful. Before we close, I want to hear from you one last time. Do you think humanity learns more from comfort or from challenge? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and many future videos on this channel come directly from your discussions. If this video gave you something to think about, like it, share it, subscribe, and consider becoming a member of the Interconnected Zone. Your support allows this space for exploration to exist. You can also send a super thanks and use the hype feature to help the conversation reach others who might be searching for deeper understanding. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and remember the future is not only something that happens to us. It is something we quietly shape day by day through the choices we make and the understanding we seek.